Hello everybody, my name's Mariako, and today we're looking at everything coming in the upcoming Village and Pillage update for Minecraft. We'll be focusing mostly on the survival aspects of the game, though I will try and cover every important change at least briefly. For Java Edition players, the update is slated to come out on April 23rd. For Bedrock and PS4 players, several of these features were already added in smaller updates, with many more coming in the upcoming 1.11 update, though there's no official release date for that just yet. This is an absolutely massive update, and covering everything has made this video rather long, so if you want to skip to a particular topic, there will be a list of timestamps in the description. With all of that said, let's jump into the new Minecraft update, Village and Pillage. Now before we dive into all of the new blocks, mobs, and mechanics, there is one particular change that affects everything in the world, and that is of course the new textures. In order to improve the inconsistent style created by years of programmer art, most textures in the game have been modified. Some changes are barely noticeable, many are distinctly different but still clearly based on the original, and in some cases they can be vastly different, Netherrack probably being the biggest example of that. If this is your first time seeing these textures, it will most likely feel wrong to you, but I do urge you to give them a chance. Having watched the community's reception to these textures being made over the past year and a half, it seems like most people come around to liking them once they're used to the change. That being said, if you're not a fan of change, you can always go into the Resource Packs menu and enable the Programmer Art Resource Pack to get the old textures back. So onto the new blocks, starting with something that is always in demand, more variants for slabs, stairs, and walls. In total, we got a whopping 14 new materials for slabs and stairs, and 12 more for walls. These materials are mostly comprised of the various stone types, both types of sandstone, prismarine, and the previously unused brick types. That does also include stair and slab versions of stone, arguably one of the longest requested block additions to the game. We also got access to several smooth block variants that you may recall being added to the creative menu in 1.13, but were uncraftable in survival until now. Those being the smooth versions of stone, quartz, sandstone, and red sandstone. These are made by cooking the normal rough versions of each block in a furnace, with the stone giving you the full block version of the smooth stone slab texture, and each of the others giving variants of their respective blocks that don't have any defining lines, making them great for smooth surfaces and builds. Do note that this new smooth stone block is now how you craft the smooth stone slabs, as the previous recipe was replaced with the new regular stone slabs. The long time requests don't stop there though. We also have new sign variants for each of the different wood colors. Obviously this is great for detail building, but you may be wondering how useful some of these signs actually are as signs, because, well, black text on a dark oak background isn't the most legible. But they added a solution to this problem as well. You can now right-click a sign with dye to change the color of the text that's on it, so you can make your signs as readable, or not, as you'd like. While we're on the topic of old block updates, they did also add new sounds to the note blocks. The block is still a massive pain to use, but you do now have 6 new sounds to work with, bringing the grand total for unique instruments in the game up to 16. In order to get these new sounds, you place one of the following blocks beneath a note block. The iron block will give you the iron xylophone. Soul sand will give you the cowbell. Pumpkins will give you the didgeridoo. Hay bales will give you the banjo. Glowstone will give you a pling, and emerald will give you a bit. Those are all fantastic additions, but there's also a huge amount of brand new blocks to check out, so let's move on to those. Minecraft is always in dire need of more light sources, and this update brings a new one in the form of the long-requested lantern, a block first considered for the game over 8 years ago. This new light source emits a light level of 15 and can be placed either on top of a block or below where it will hang from a small chain. These can be crafted by surrounding a torch with iron nuggets in a crafting table. There is another new block that acts as a light source as well, though it comes with far more functionality beyond that, and that is the new Campfire. Not only is this a new visual way of using fire to light our builds, but that fire will also not destroy items, nor will it spread, making it safe for use in flammable builds. The fire will be lit by default when placed down, but can be extinguished using water and relit using a flint and steel. This block is also functional and can be used to cook food. The cooking process is slower than a furnace, taking a full 30 seconds to cook, but it can also cook 4 items at a time, making it slightly faster overall. The biggest advantage, however, is the fact that it doesn't take up any fuel to cook things, making it very useful if you're low on resources in a new world. The food items will automatically pop off after being cooked, but unfortunately there's no way to fully automate placing the food in the first place. You may also have noticed the new type of particles that this block emits. In addition to just being a nice new particle to build with, these can also be turned into smoke signals. If you place a hay bale underneath your campfire, the smoke will go much higher, from the original 10 blocks up to 25. These particles will also stay visible from very long distances, making them a great way to leave markers in your world. If you want these new campfires, all you need to do is place 3 logs across the bottom of a crafting table, a coal or charcoal in the middle spot, and 3 sticks in the slots surrounding that. The campfire isn't the only new way to cook food though, there's also the smoker block, the first of many new utility blocks. This block works exactly the same as a furnace, except that it only works on food items, but in return for that limitation, it does cook food at twice the normal speed. Unfortunately, this extra efficiency only applies to the speed of cooking. It does still use up the same amount of fuel in the end. Still, it's a nice excuse to make unique builds specifically for cooking food, and this one can of course be automated with hoppers and droppers. These are crafted by surrounding a furnace with 4 logs in a crafting grid. It's not only food that got this treatment, ores and things made from them such as armor and tools can also be smelted at twice the speed using the new blast furnace. Much like the smoker, this is purely for the doubled speed. The amount of fuel, XP output, and automation is all the same as a regular furnace. If you want to create a blast furnace, you'll need to place 3 of the new smooth stone blocks across the bottom of a crafting grid, place a furnace in the middle slot, and fill the remaining 5 slots with iron ingots. Continuing with our new processing blocks, next up we have the composter. The composter is a means of taking excess food and plant material and turning it into something useful, that being bone meal. Right-clicking on a composter with any compatible item will attempt to compost that item, and if you do so successfully 7 times, you can right-click the composter again to get out a single bone meal. All valid plant and food items have different chances of successfully composting, ranging from 30% up to a 100% chance for items that are clearly not worth composting. In normal gameplay, it's obviously easier to farm bones for bone meal than to depend on the slow rates of a composter, but the real advantage is in automation. You can put items into the composter with a hopper pointing into the top, and pull the bone meal out via a hopper underneath it. This means that instead of destroying excess items from crop farms, we can easily turn them into something more useful. At the moment, the recipe for the composter is different between Java and Bedrock. On Java, it's 3 planks across the bottom of a crafting grid, with fences in the remaining 2 spots on each side. But on Bedrock, it is 7 wooden slabs in a U shape, similar to the cauldron recipe. Not all of the new blocks are about processing materials. Some of them are to help with crafting. This is the case for the loom, our new way of customizing banners. Instead of needing many different recipes that can only really be learned outside of the game to create patterns, this block gives us an easy-to-use GUI to accomplish the same thing. Now when you want to put a pattern on a banner, you simply place the banner into the loom, along with the dye color you want to use for the pattern. You can then choose any of the basic patterns on the right side and pull the finished banner out from the bottom right corner. This will also only take 1 dye each time rather than 3 to 8 like it did previously. Plus, it has a very versatile texture for building. The loom itself can be crafted in a 2x2 grid with 2 planks on the bottom and 2 string on top. Of course, that still leaves the more complex shapes, things like the oxeye daisy or creeper face, which are now done by creating banner patterns. Instead of combining the base items with the banner itself, you now combine them with paper to form the banner pattern item. This pattern can then be placed into the loom and give you that special design, and the pattern will not be used up in the process, meaning you only ever need to create 1 of each. There are currently 5 such patterns in the Java edition, those being the Oxeye Daisy, Wither Skull, Creeper Skull, Mojang logo, and the new globe pattern which can only be gotten through trades. We'll be talking more about that one later on. In the Bedrock edition, the Field Masoned, which is the brick, and the Bourgeois Indented, which is the wavy edge pattern, those require the special banner patterns to be made using bricks and vines respectively, similar to how they were done previously. Maps also got this special block treatment with the new cartography table, making maps easier to work with and adding to their functionality. Obviously, the old crafting recipes were built into this new block. Placing a map in the table along with a single piece of paper will allow you to expand it, while placing in an empty map will allow you to make copies of the original. This also applies to the Bedrock edition and adding compasses to create a locator map. There is also a new option, however, and that's adding a glass pane to the map. This will lock the map and prevent it from ever being updated. This will allow you to do things like make a progressive map of your builds over time to see how they've grown without risking the maps getting updated and ruined, or similarly working on multiple iterations of a single map art. Of course, these locked maps can still be copied as well. Creating the cartography table is simply placing planks in a 2x2 and placing 2 paper in the spots above that. Another new block that expands on old mechanics is the grindstone. This is an expansion of the old equipment combining system where you would put 2 pieces into a crafting grid to combine them together, but again, it has some new additions on top of that. Do note that this does mean you can't combine things in your inventory any longer, even small things like shears. Much like before, combining 2 pieces of equipment together will essentially sacrifice one to repair the other, and this will still remove any enchantments except for curses. Now, however, you will also get some XP back based on the levels of the enchantments you're erasing. More usefully, you can also put a single tool in to simply remove any non-curse enchantments from it without needing to waste another tool. Meaning if you aren't happy after an enchantment, you can simply remove the enchants and try again, and it's only going to cost you some experience. To craft a grindstone, you take a stone slab with a stick on each side and a plank under each one of the sticks. The next block is a little less significant, but neat all the same. The stonecutter is mostly just an alternative way of crafting most stone-type blocks. Placing something like a stone, prismarine, or quartz block into the stonecutter will let you make any of the block variants that could be made with that material, including going straight to the stone brick variants using stone. Technically, this allows you to make more precise amounts of blocks, say crafting only 2 slabs from a block instead of needing to make 6 if you don't actually need that many. Generally not a big deal, but it is notably more efficient on stairs, as each stair only takes 1 block instead of 1.5 like it does in the regular recipe. Again, not a huge deal, but at the very least the animated saw texture is pretty sweet. Crafting the stonecutter is simply placing 3 stone across the bottom of a crafting grid with an iron ingot in the middle slot. We're not done with these new functional blocks just yet, I promise we're getting there, but next up we have the lectern. The lectern isn't so much about utility as it is just a neat block. Essentially, it allows you to visibly place down a written book, allowing players, even multiple at once, to walk up and read it. The lectern does also give a redstone pulse each time the page is changed, as well as outputs a constant signal based on the currently open page of the book. The signal strength is based on how far into the book you are, with the final page always being a full 15 strength signal. This means that if your book is exactly 15 pages long, the redstone signal strength will increase by 1 for each page. This is an extremely handy way of making something like a selection system, or of course something a little more insidious. The lectern is crafted by placing a bookshelf in the middle slot of a crafting table, 3 wooden slabs going across the top, and 1 more in the bottom slot below the bookshelf. Next up, we have a very simple new addition with the barrel. This is mostly a visual addition, as they are quite a useful texture to have, but they do also function as a simple means of storage. Essentially, these are just another version of single chests that don't merge together and also don't require any space above them to be opened. They can of course be automated in the same way as regular chests as well. The barrel is another block with different recipes in Java and Bedrock. In Java, the recipe is 3 planks down each side of a crafting grid, with wooden slabs in the top and bottom slots of the middle column. On Bedrock it's the same, but the planks are replaced with sticks. Another simple but cool detail block is the new bell. Quite simply, this is just a small bell that you can place against the top, bottom, or sides of a block. Right-clicking that bell will ring it and will cause it to sway back and forth, as will shooting it with an arrow. The bell does actually have one more functionality that's tied to villages, as do most of the functional blocks we just covered, and we'll be covering all of that shortly. Just know that all of these recent blocks do serve one more very important purpose. These bells also cannot be crafted. You either have to steal them from a village or trade for them from one of these smithing villagers. On that note, there are actually 2 more utility blocks, the fletching table and the smithing table. These 2 exist in-game and can be crafted, but currently don't have any interaction with players. We've been told that both of these blocks are instead going to tie in with changes coming in the next update. This leads into the general belief that the next major update will be another big revision to combat, with these 2 crafting tables likely being used to modify our equipment in some way. Very exciting, but we won't know the details of that for quite a while. If you want to craft these blocks now, just for the sake of decoration, each one has a different recipe in both Java and Bedrock. In the Java edition, the fletching table is planks in a 2x2 grid with 2 flints on top, and the smithing table is planks in a 2x2 grid with 2 iron ingots on top. In the Bedrock edition, the fletching table is simply a crafting table combined with an arrow, and the smithing table is a crafting table combined with a piece of cobblestone. There were a few other small changes relating to crafting blocks, such as that both glass panes and white carpets can now be dyed, at least in the Java edition. This is of course done by surrounding the dye color of your choice with either of those blocks. There was also a change to how transparent blocks are handled in the game to allow more things to be placed onto them. This is still somewhat inconsistent feeling, and at first it certainly feels like a minor change, but it does actually open up some very cool detail building options for us, like supporting ladders with trapdoors or making mostly floating rails. Always keep an open mind with these seemingly small changes, they can make a world of difference. There has also been a massive change to lighting and how it interacts with certain kinds of blocks. This has big implications for certain visual glitches, as well as a lot of different hidden lighting techniques, but also gives us some very cool new behavior as well. Most notably, they made a lot of blocks handle lighting based on directional opacity, essentially meaning that they will only let light through if there is a gap for it to come through. This means that blocks like slabs and stairs will actually properly let light through their gaps now, which is very cool, but keep this change in mind if you were using them to block out light in one of your builds. This change also fixed a lot of glitches, such as light shining through slabs and stairs visually, which was simultaneously cool looking, but also very annoying. Unfortunately, some common ways of hidden lighting were also broken with this, most notably blocks like pistons, enchanting tables, and snow layers, which will now only let light through if there is a visible gap for it. This does not apply to all blocks though. Things like carpets, trapdoors, hoppers, cauldrons, daylight sensors, all of those still work fine. So of course there are pros and cons here, losing some building tricks but gaining others. Whether it's worked out for the best or not is up to you. Now there is one more major building block we have yet to cover, and this one is a game changer. That is of course the new scaffolding block. While this is obviously an interesting looking block and will certainly find a lot of use in builds, its main purpose is to solve the age-old problem of covering our builds in ugly dirt pillars that are hard to navigate and time-consuming to remove. And it's actually been done in a pretty clever way. Placing these blocks down is fairly intuitive. The first scaffold always needs to be placed on top of a solid block. After that, you can place more by clicking directly on the scaffold itself. If you click on the sides, then you will place a new scaffold on top of the stack you're clicking on to easily make a tower, and this can be done repeatedly all the way up as high as you'd like. Climbing these pillars is also fairly easy, as scaffolding blocks don't have normal collision, allowing you to walk right through them from the sides. More importantly, when standing inside of or on top of these blocks, you can now climb up or down by holding jump or crouch respectively. You can even stop at any point while traveling up a pillar of scaffolding, and you will simply stop on top of the closest scaffold below you. Once you have the height you want, you can climb up this pillar, and by right-clicking on the top of a scaffold, or while inside of one, you will place a new scaffold out from the side you're facing, forming a bridge. There's no need to sneak over the edge or any of that. You can simply keep placing them by facing in the direction you want to go and clicking on top of existing scaffolding. Now, scaffolding does need support pillars fairly often. In fact, it will only go outwards a maximum of 6 blocks horizontally in Java and 4 in Bedrock before the scaffolds will simply fall off the edge. These falling scaffolds actually solve this problem, however, as they will automatically stack up, forming a new support that you can use to continue your bridge onwards. All of this is very useful, but the single greatest thing about scaffolds is when you are done using them and need to clean them up. Since the scaffolds need support to stay up, you can simply go around breaking the bottom of each support pillar and the entire structure will start breaking apart and falling to the ground. Not only is this far easier than destroying a web of dirt blocks, but it's got a pretty satisfying sound to go along with it. So after all of that, how are they made? Well, the scaffolding is actually crafted using a brand new resource, and that's bamboo. Placing 3 bamboo up each side of a crafting grid with a string in the top middle slot will give you 6 scaffolds. That's all very cool, but where does bamboo come from? Bamboo is a new plant type that you can find specifically in jungle biomes. In regular jungle biomes, you'll only find a little bit scattered here and there, but occasionally you may stumble into a dedicated bamboo jungle sub-biome that will be absolutely packed with the stuff. If you're really struggling to find any, you can also find small amounts by fishing in a jungle or within loot chests. Of course, once you find some, you can farm it yourself by placing it on most forms of dirt, sand, or gravel. Bamboo is the fastest growing plant in the game on its own, quickly reaching up to 16 blocks tall, but it can also be bone mealed if you want to speed up the process. In addition to the scaffolds, the bamboo items can be used to create sticks by placing 2 bamboo on top of each other in a crafting grid, or they can be used as a very limited fuel source that cooks 1/4 of an item per bamboo. Given how fast they grow, it's not quite as bad an option for that as it may sound. You can also place them in flower pots for a neat little detail. Now, bamboo does actually have one more important purpose, but we'll be covering that in a few minutes. First, there are a few more new forms of plant life we have to cover. First are the new flowers, of which there are 3. The cornflower is a small blue flower that generates in plains biomes and can be turned into blue dye, and the lily of the valley is a drooping white flower that generates in forest biomes and can be turned into white dye. Both of these flowers can also, of course, generate in flower forest biomes. Do note that this does mean the flower pattern in flower forests will change slightly. Thankfully, it hasn't changed too much, but depending on your luck, your flower farms may lose or gain some flower types. The third flower is a little bit more interesting. This is the Wither Rose, an ominous-looking black flower that can be turned into black dye, but also has a few unique properties. The Wither Rose is the only flower to not generate naturally. Instead, this flower is only created when a non-undead mob is killed by the Wither. The flower will automatically plant onto the block below if it's dirt, grass, netherrack, or soul sand. If not, then the flower will simply drop as an item. If you manage to snag one of these flowers, they will also have the unique ability of putting the withering effect on the entities that touch them. Any mob, or player, other than the wither skeletons or the wither themselves obviously, will constantly gain a short duration of the wither debuff so long as they are within the bounding box of the flower. Mobs can even spawn directly on top of these flowers, making for some very interesting mob farm designs. There is one more new plant type this update, and that is of course the new sweet berry bush. These little shrubs will generate naturally in any of the taiga variants and more rarely in any of the snowy taiga variants, and of course will grow sweet berries. They have 4 stages of growth, which will yield 3 to 4 berries when fully grown, or 1 to 2 if harvested early, and you can bone meal them to speed up this process. In addition to that, the bushes themselves will slow entities passing through them, similar to how a cobweb does, and do small amounts of damage in the process. The sweet berries themselves are a fairly weak food source, only healing 2 hunger, which is 1 haunch, and aren't really used in any special recipes. They do have one other interaction, which, again, we will be covering shortly. There are a couple other significant tweaks to existing plants that I want to mention quickly as well. First is that you can now climb hanging vines, which you previously could not unless there was a supporting block behind them. Very useful in navigating jungles. Second is that chorus flowers on top of chorus plants can now be popped off by shooting them with a bow, meaning you no longer need to pillar up to break them off. There was also a few small changes to certain items, for example, dyes. Most notably, bone meal, ink sacks, cocoa beans, and lapis are no longer used as dyes directly. Instead, you place these items into a crafting grid to turn them into their corresponding dye color. You'll also find that all of the dyes are consistently named based on color now, instead of several having unique names while others did not. The book in Quill has also had some modifications to make it easier to work with. Things like being able to freely move the cursor, including with the mouse, as well as select, copy, and paste text throughout. They've even added shortcuts like double-clicking to select a word or triple-clicking to select an entire page. The handling of text and things like line wrapping were also improved, and the page count was doubled from 50 pages up to 100. There were some new items added in as well, specifically new equipment, and it's not only for the player. The leather horse armor from the Bedrock edition is added to the Java version with this update, giving us an alternative way to protect our horses or just give them a bit of style. Many different styles in fact, as this armor can be dyed the same way as regular leather armor, meaning there are over 12 million unique color options. You can get this leather horse armor by placing 7 leather in the shape of an H in your crafting grid, or by trading a leather worker. There was also a new ranged weapon added to the game in the form of a crossbow. This is a new alternative to our usual bow with, at base level, more range and power than a normal bow. The downside is that each shot takes longer to charge and cannot be released fully before it's loaded. Firing the crossbow is a 2-step process, first holding down right-click to load your shot, and then clicking again when you want to fire. This does not need to be done instantaneously, however. Unlike the bow, you can load your shot and then simply leave it loaded, even switching away from the weapon entirely and switching back later for an instant shot. The crossbow is held back somewhat by its enchantments, however. It can of course use unbreaking and mending enchantments, but it can't use any of the bow-specific ones. This means no infinity, flame, punch, or power, and a maxed out enchanted bow will end up doing substantially more damage than a crossbow because of that. The crossbow does have some unique enchantments of its own, however. Quick Charge will increase the draw speed of your crossbow, maxing out at rank 3, at which point it will actually load slightly faster than a regular bow. Piercing will allow your shots to pass through and hit multiple enemies at once, with the max number of enemies you can shoot through corresponding to the level of enchantments +1, so up to 5 enemies in total. And finally, multi-shot will make each shot launch a spread of 3 projectiles, which won't use up any additional ammo, but they do cause 3 times durability loss on the crossbow. Unfortunately, both multi-shot and piercing are mutually exclusive and cannot be put on the same crossbow legitimately. There is one other unique property to the crossbow, and that's that it can shoot more than just arrows. You're also able to load in fireworks by holding them in your offhands and fire those, whether just because it looks cool or because you want to kill things with fantastic explosions. The range of the fireworks is determined by its duration, and if they're made with firework stars, they will explode either at max range or when they collide with a mob. This can even disorientate the mob and make them lose track of you, but do be careful that you're not too close to the blast yourself. And yes, the multi-shot enchantment will shoot out 3 fireworks each time. So the crossbow is definitely an interesting option with some unique uses, though much like the other weapon alternatives, it's not likely to break the classic sword and bow combo for most people. If you do want to try one out, you can craft it by placing a tripwire hook in the middle slot of a crafting table, a string on each side, an iron ingot in the top middle slot, and then a stick in the top 2 corners and the bottom middle slot. There is one other new item to cover, and that is a new food source, Suspicious Stew. This is very similar to mushroom stew. In fact, it gives the same hunger and saturation and is crafted in almost the same way. A bowl, a red mushroom, and a brown mushroom, but for the Suspicious Stew you also add a flour to the mix. Each flour has a set effect that will give the resulting stew, but once that stew is crafted, you can't tell which flour went into it. If you're willing to risk sampling these mystery stews, you will get one of 9 different possible effects. Arguably, with such short durations on these effects, these aren't really a huge deal, mostly because they also can't be stacked, but they could be fun in more niche purposes like minigames. This Suspicious Stew does tie into one other new addition as well, though, and that is the brown mooshroom. These are a special new and somewhat hard to obtain version of the regular red mooshroom. There's only 2 ways to obtain these guys for the first time in your world. One is by breeding 2 red mooshrooms together, but that only gives you a 1 in 1024 chance of getting a brown one. This also happens in reverse if you happen to be breeding 2 brown mooshrooms and wonder why you got a red one. The other method is to strike a red mooshroom with lightning, which thanks to channeling tridents isn't too difficult to achieve these days, and this will swap either of the mooshrooms to the opposite type. For the most part, these are just a different skin of the red mooshroom, but they do have one unique property. While milking them with a bowl will still produce normal mushroom stew, if you feed the brown mooshroom a flour first, it will instead produce the corresponding type of Suspicious Stew when it's milked instead. So feeding them a dandelion will give you the saturation Suspicious Stew, for example. This only happens for 1 bowl before they go back to normal stew, but you can trigger this effect as often as you want, reducing the cost of Suspicious Stew down to only the flour and a free bowl. Another classic mob got a bit of a rework, and that is the ocelot. Ocelots can no longer be tamed and do not turn into cats. You can, however, still feed them fish to make them trust you, which will make them stop running away anytime you're near. So if ocelots no longer turn into cats, what's happened to those? Cats are now their own unique mob. You'll find stray cats wandering around villages, and you can also find exclusively black cats around witch huts. There's also a little quirk in the Bedrock edition that 50% of cats spawned during a full moon will be black. In total, there are now 11 different variations of cat that you can find. The original 3, which is red, tuxedo, and Siamese. 7 new ones from Mojang, those being white, black, tabby, British shorthair, calico, Persian, and ragdoll, and one that was chosen by a community contest. The winner ended up being Jelly, the real-life pets of Good Times with Scar. If anyone deserves to have a cat added to the game, it's definitely Scar, so big congratulations to him on that. Stray cats behave similar to ocelots, running away from the player anytime you get near, but they can be tempted in and tamed using fish. While untamed, they will attack rabbits and baby turtles, and cats in general still scare away creepers, but will also now scare away phantoms. Once you've managed to tame one, you can now dye their color by right-clicking them with any dye. You can also still breed cats once they're tamed, with the kitten automatically being tamed by the owner of the original cats and taking on the appearance of one of the parents. Tamed cats will also try and sleep alongside the player that tamed them if the player tries to sleep nearby, and will even leave gifts for the player to find when they wake up. Being cats, these tend to be things like string, feather, raw chicken, rabbit's foot, rabbit hide, rotten flesh, or in rare cases, a phantom membrane. And if you're wondering what cats drop when they die, it would just be string. You monster. Continuing the cuddly passive mob trend, next up we have the new pandas. These adorable fellas spawn exclusively within the bamboo jungle subbiomes we saw earlier, just hanging out and eating bamboo all day. In fact, if they see any bamboo or cake items laying on the ground, they will wander over, pick them up, and chow down on them. Pandas will also, usually, follow a player who is holding bamboo, which can also be used to breed two pandas together. They're a little more picky than most other mobs, however, as if you try and breed them somewhere they aren't happy with, they will just shake their heads at you and refuse. They need to see at least 8 bamboo blocks planted within a 5-block radius of themselves to be comfortable enough to make a baby. When the pandas do breed, their genetics come into play. Each parent panda has 2 genetic traits, and when bred together, the game will randomly choose one from each to pass down to the baby. This determines what kind of personality the panda will have, each with slightly different traits and a different face texture. There are 7 potential outcomes. Normal, which is just a basic panda and is similar to most passive mobs in behavior. Aggressive, who is still technically a passive mob, but if you attack him or another panda nearby, he will attack back. Playful, which will frequently roll around or jump into the air even as adults. Lazy, which will spend much of their time laying on their back and lounging around, and won't even follow the player with bamboo when they're doing so. They're also slower than normal in general, making them the slowest natural mob in the game. Next is Worried, which will actively avoid being near players or most hostile mobs, won't eat items off the ground, and will shake in fear during thunderstorms. Next is Weak, which are somewhat sickly, having half of their normal maximum health, and will sneeze fairly often as babies. There's also an Easter egg that sneezing baby pandas will make nearby adults jump into the air. And the final one is Brown. Now this one has the same behavior as the normal panda, but it has a rare brown coloring for its entire texture. Due to how the genetics of the pandas work, the weak and brown pandas have a particularly low chance of spawning, as they will always prioritize the other genes first. For either one to happen, both of the pandas' genes need to be one of these 2 options. We're still not done with the cute mobs. There is of course one left, the mob added in by the previous Minecon vote, foxes. These are a new passive mob that spawns in both taiga and snowy taiga variants, sometimes intentionally spawning near villages in these areas, and will spawn more frequently at nighttime. In fact, they are primarily nocturnal animals, spending most of their nights hunting and sneaking into villages, while during the day they try and sleep underneath trees and ledges, or occasionally just sit out in the open. There are actually 2 different kinds of foxes, depending on which biome they spawn in. If it's a regular taiga variant, you'll get a normal red fox. If it's one of the snowy taiga variants, you will instead get an Arctic fox with a white coat. Other than their visual appearance, they are almost the same, but there is a slight difference in their hunting habits. Foxes will actively hunt down small animals like chickens, rabbits, baby turtles, and most kinds of fish. They'll try and get close before leaping into the air and trying to pounce on them from above, and they can even get themselves stuck in snow layers for a second while doing this. This leap that they do can actually go up over 3 blocks into the air, and they will use this to get over things like fences and walls to reach what they're after. The difference between the 2 types in this regard is that red foxes will prioritize going after animals on land, while Arctic foxes will prefer to go for fish if they're around. Foxes aren't exactly an apex predator though. They do need to watch out for wolves and polar bears, even the babies, who will try and attack them. Thankfully the foxes are pretty spry and run faster than either of them, giving them a good chance to get away. Foxes can't be fully tamed, but you can breed 2 foxes together using the new sweet berries. If one of the parents is an Arctic fox, the baby will always be one as well, and the new baby will trust being around you, similar to the new ocelot mechanics. Do note that while they are still babies, they will prioritize following their parents around, and thus can still run away from you. While these trusting foxes aren't quite like normal tamed mobs, they will still try and defend you if they see you get hit. Having an attack fox can actually be a pretty powerful weapon due to their last mechanic, which is holding items. Foxes will pick up and hold items in their mouths, and that applies to any kind of item. In fact, they can even spawn holding items at times, mostly drops from chickens and rabbits, but also items like leather, pork chops, wheat, and even emeralds, presumably swiped from villages. In general, they will prioritize picking up food items, and with the exception of cake, they will also eat this food shortly afterwards. Any special effect from the food will actually affect the fox as well, even things like the teleportation from the chorus fruit. This doesn't apply to food alone though. Like I said, they can pick up pretty much any item, and while they are holding it, they are essentially using it. This means you can give your fox a powerful sword, and their attacks can actually be quite deadly. As the foxes prioritize food, they will actively drop whatever they are carrying to grab a snack. They will also specifically go after berry bushes and pluck berries off of them, dropping whatever they are carrying at the time to do so. They are in fact so adept at doing this that the slowing effect of the berry bushes doesn't impact them at all. Not all new mobs in this update are cute and cuddly. It's named Village and Pillage after all, so let's take a look at the not so friendly side of this update, the Pillagers. Pillagers are a new member of the Illager family, and much like their mansion-dwelling cousins, they are not very friendly. Like other Illagers, they are slightly sturdier than normal hostile mobs, having 24 HP, but they are unique in that they attack using the new Crossbow weapon. Their damage has been toned down a bit to only 4 to 5 damage per shot, depending on world difficulty, so individually they aren't particularly dangerous, but you'll also rarely be fighting them one-on-one. On the Java edition, the Pillagers don't drop much, usually just some arrows and a small chance at dropping their crossbow. On the Bedrock edition, they also have a chance of dropping emeralds, which is affected by looting, as well as various iron equipment or an enchanted book. So where do you find these guys? Well, there are 3 different ways that they can spawn. First is at a new structure, the Pillager Outpost. These are tall towers that can generate in any biome that villages can also naturally generate in, usually within a few hundred blocks of an actual village. There's also a bit of variation in these towers, both in how worn the structure is and in the details surrounding it, which are always randomly chosen. There is of course also a small loot reward for coming here in the form of a chest containing some general resources like crops, arrows, or iron, but also enchanted books and crossbows. They are of course also crawling with the new Pillagers. You can pretty much guess how this goes. If you get close, you have a swarm of angry gray people shooting crossbows at you, but one of them will stand out. Each outpost has a designated leader, an outpost captain who will be carrying an Illager banner, though they still behave mostly the same as regular Pillagers. Killing this leader will give you a new effect called Bad Omen, but we'll cover what that means shortly. First, let's cover the second way that Pillagers can spawn, an Illager patrol. These are small groups containing up to 5 mobs, made up mostly of Pillagers, but can also include some Vindicators as well. One of these mobs will again be designated the captain and carry an ominous banner. Should that captain be killed, another Illager will rush to try and pick that banner up and become the new captain themselves. The captain of the patrol will always try and lead the patrol towards their goal, and that goal is a village. These patrols will spawn within a couple hundred blocks of a village and slowly work their way in towards it. Once they reach it, they will go on the attack, trying to kill off any villagers or iron golems they see. The Vindicators can even get through doors, so you have to keep a really close eye on these guys in particular. You can of course stop these patrols and kill off all of the Illagers, but again, when you kill the original leader, you're going to get the Bad Omen effect. This Bad Omen effect that you get from killing one of the Illager captains ties into the third way that these mobs spawn. This effect will last forever, but can be removed with milk, and on its own won't do anything to you. But if you enter a village with the effect on you, you will trigger a raid. Think of this like a wave-based boss fight of sorts. You'll even have a big health bar pop up on the top of your screen, corresponding to the number of mobs left to kill in each wave. These raids are multiple waves of increasingly strong groups of enemies that will attack the village. There will be 3, 5, or 7 waves of these enemies, depending on what difficulty level your world is set to. If you manage to get multiple levels of Bad Omen, you will add 1 additional wave to the end. The village itself does have a tool to help with this. In the village center, usually denoted by something like a well, or market stalls, or a fountain, some kind of special build like that, you will find one of the new bell blocks. If you ring this, or if one of the villagers does, the villagers will rush into their homes and hide, and any of the raiding mobs will also be given a few seconds of the glowing effect, making it easier for you to spot them. While the villagers are running away, and also breaking out into a nervous sweat, you and any nearby iron golems can deal with the raid. As the waves of the raid go on, you'll start seeing not only more enemies, they will also get stronger and you'll see even more types of them. In higher levels, Pillagers will start having more enchanted crossbows, and you'll gradually see more Vindicators in the mix. Witches will eventually join in and start using various potions to help the other raiders, and at the highest levels, even Evokers will come to attack the village. There is also another brand new mob that joins in on these raids, the Ravager. This hulking beast will join in even in the relatively low waves and is probably the most dangerous thing you'll face. They're built like a tank, having 100 HP, same as an iron golem, and their strongest attack will do 7 to 18 damage depending on world difficulty. Their main form of attack is charging at you and bashing into you with their horns, but this attack can be blocked using a shield. A successful block has a 50% chance of stunning the Ravager for a couple seconds, but once this wears off, he will roar, dealing a small burst of damage and knocking any nearby enemies back. Combined with a 50% chance to not be knocked back himself when hit, these guys can be pretty tough if you're not well geared. To top it off, the Ravager will frequently also have an Illager variant of some kind riding on his back, making them even more dangerous to deal with. They also have the unique property of breaking many types of plant blocks with their charges. On Bedrock Edition, this applies to pretty much anything that's a plant. On Java, it seems to be limited to crops and leaf blocks. Unfortunately, they don't drop anything particularly noteworthy, just their saddle. So eventually this raid will end. You've either killed off all of the raiders or they've killed off the village, and whichever side wins gets to celebrate. If the raiders are successful, they will cheer and jump around in glory, with even the Ravager getting excited. The mobs spawned in by the raids also don't seem to ever despawn, so they're just around that village forever. If you manage to successfully fend off the raid, the villagers are instead the ones celebrating, shooting off fireworks and giving you the Hero of the Village buff. This effect will last for 2 full in-game days, during which time the villagers will randomly throw you gifts and their trades will be a bit cheaper. This doesn't seem like a huge deal, but it is actually a very interesting new facet to villager-based item farming. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. So, having seen the villages quite a bit already, I'm sure you've noticed that they are looking a whole lot different from what they were previously. In fact, just about every aspect relating to villages has been completely overhauled with this version. Of course, the first thing you'll notice is that the villages themselves look completely different visually. Each type of village, based on which biome they generate in, now has its own distinct style rather than just being block swaps. On top of that, each one has dozens of unique structures that they can randomly choose between, ranging from specialized houses to animal pens, even down to small unique details, all making villages feel far more diverse and interesting than before. They're still not going to win any building contests, but it really is a huge improvement. On top of that, every time a new village generates, regardless of size, it will also create a natural iron golem. This gives them at least some chance of surviving through a pillager patrol. There is even an entirely new type of village, one that generates specifically in the snowy tundra and snowy taiga type biomes. This one even has a few structures made out of ice and snow thrown into the mix. Definitely the coziest of the villages. Zombie villages were also improved slightly. If you're not aware, because they are rather obscure, 2% of villages in the world are zombie villages. This means that the doors are broken down, the torches are removed, and all of the villagers are replaced with zombie villagers. These are now a little more decrepit looking, with more mossy cobble and with wood blocks occasionally replaced by cobwebs, things like that. Clearly it wasn't only the buildings that got a new look, the villagers did as well. In fact, they too have a unique appearance based on which type of village they're from, combined with a new visual indicator for what their profession is. Basically, if you're looking for, say, a farmer villager, they will always have a big straw hat, but their base clothing will change based on their village, and this of course applies to every profession. In addition to just looking better, it also makes it easier to identify villagers that previously looked the same, like librarians and cartographers, for example. Counting the new snowy taiga and tundra variants, there are now 5 unique village types in the game. There are, however, 2 more villager types beyond that which will not generate naturally, those being the swamp and jungle villagers. Supposedly it was decided that leaving these 2 villages in the hands of the player to create would be better for the game. While I would consider that debatable, it's at least nice to have these 2 as options should you want them. These changes weren't only visual. In fact, pretty much everything about the mechanics of villagers has been changed. Let's start with how their professions are chosen, because this is no longer just a set thing once they're born. Villagers will now start out as unemployed and will generally seek out a profession based on what their village needs, and this depends on the utility blocks within the village. You'll notice that the buildings in these new villages aren't just generic structures. Many of them seem to have a purpose. One building may contain a lectern and a lot of bookshelves, while another will have a blast furnace and armor stands. These blocks are what villagers use to determine their profession. For example, if your village generates with 2 composters and only 1 farmer, an unemployed villager may become a farmer to fill that gap. Most of the new utility blocks we covered earlier are tied to a specific profession, as are the brewing stand and cauldron. Once a villager chooses their block, their profession is tied to that specific block. No other villager can use it, and if that block gets destroyed, the villager essentially loses their job and goes back to being unemployed. It's important to note that villagers who have already leveled up on a particular profession will only be able to choose that profession going forward. You can't just level up one villager and constantly cycle them between professions. You need to have a bunch of individual ones should you want to trade with them. The only adult villager that won't do any of this is, naturally, the nitwit. Once they choose their profession, you can of course trade with them like before, but that system has also been completely overhauled. One minor change is that if you hold something the villager is willing to trade for, they will also hold out what they want to trade you. But much more noteworthy is the brand new trading UI. The first thing you'll notice is that all of their trades show up in a convenient list on the left side. Clicking a trade from that list will automatically put the maximum amount of resources it can in for that trade. You'll also notice a small bar at the top of the window that looks suspiciously similar to your experience bar. That's because villagers also level up now. As you trade villagers, they will get XP, with the later and generally more impressive trades giving more, and this is how you unlock new trades. Each time you fill up the XP bar, the villager will level up, and will reveal 2 more trades, with each villager having 5 different levels in total. This level is also shown on the villager visually, via a small badge attached to their belt, which changes based on their current level. On the Java edition, this will go stone to iron to gold to emerald and finally to diamond, but on the Bedrock edition there are, for some reason, only 3 visual levels: iron, gold, and diamond. Unlike recent versions of the game, the new villager trades are not completely predetermined. Each level for each type of villager has different potential trades, and the villager will randomly choose 2 of these trades to use. For example, one farmer villager may choose both potato and carrot trades, while another will have neither. These trades also have a set number of uses before locking, most of which are 6 or 8 trades depending on what the trade is, though some of the better equipment trades are capped at only 2 trades. Unlocking trades that have been locked up also works very differently. Instead of happening randomly when trading, villagers will now unlock their trades at 2 set times during the day when they go to use their workstation. This means you do have a rather limited number of trades you can do per day, and any villager trading systems will also need to give villagers access to their workstation for them to restock. In addition to that, the prices of most trades aren't static anymore. Instead, the villagers' prices will vary based on supply and demand, as well as how much they like you. Basically, this means that if you continuously use 1 or 2 trades on a single villager, they will get more and more expensive each time they unlock. There are some exceptions, but for most trades that you'll be using frequently, this is the case. The trades will also get more expensive very quickly if you anger the villagers, most notably by hitting them, so if you need to give them a nudge, be sure to use a fishing rod instead. What all of this translates to is that it's not practical to trade a single villager in mass quantities anymore. Not only is it time-gated, but if you repeat a trade as frequently as possible, it will get very expensive. Trading pumpkins, for example, used to be a great source for infinite emeralds, but now doing that trade over and over again will eventually become selling an entire stack of pumpkins to get a single emerald in return. This does take quite a few cycles of continuous trading to reach, and the price will slowly come back down afterwards, but you'll likely want to diversify your trading a bit more than before. There were also some new trades added in this process, quite a few in fact, and given that we'll want to use a variety of trades now, some of these new trades actually look like really good ways to get emeralds. Here's some noteworthy examples of that. All of these things are renewable, or at least easily gathered resources, and are worth considering as new ways of getting emeralds, though getting some of these trades themselves can actually be kind of difficult due to the variety of new trades on some of these new villagers. There are of course also some new things to buy as well, again some noteworthy examples here. You may have noticed a new profession snuck in there as well, that being the new mason. You can sell him things like clay, the various stone types or raw quartz, and buy bricks, various refined stone blocks, terracotta, and quartz blocks. I mentioned before that villagers need to go to their workstations to restock their trades. This is actually part of their new behavior system. Basically, throughout the day, villagers have certain tasks that they follow. In general, this just means they spend most of their time, quote-unquote, working by standing near their chosen workstation. They will also occasionally wander the village, maybe chit-chat with others, and certain professions have other things they tend to, like farmers replanting crops or librarians looking over bookshelves. They will also, shortly before sunset, gather together at the town center. Once again, this will be a special structure with a bell attached somewhere nearby, as we saw when talking about the Illager Raids earlier. This is a very important part of their day, as this is when the villagers gossip, and much like real-life gossip, they are totally talking about you. If you anger a villager or make them happy with trades, they will pass that on to others, and the price of the trades across the village will reflect this. This is also how iron golems are spawned now, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. After their town meeting is over and the gossip is done, they will head home. Each villager will have one specific bed that they call their own, and they will head to it, relaxing in their house for a short while before hopping into bed for the rest of the night. This does not influence their ability to trade, but it does have an effect on iron golem spawning and does also heal the villagers when they wake up. There are 3 types of villagers that behave slightly differently than this. Unemployed villagers are mostly the same, but will spend their days wandering around the village looking for an unused workstation to use for themselves, at which point they will just switch to that profession. Baby villagers will spend their time running around the village with other babies, jumping on beds, and being cautious of iron golems, and nitwits are the last exception. These guys stay up a bit later than other villagers and also sleep in each morning. They don't really do much else during the day, with the exception of occasionally deciding to go back to sleep for a while. For those of you with existing villager trading setups, that all probably sounded pretty scary, but don't worry, your existing trades should remain available to you. Of course, their prices will fluctuate now, and you'll need to add workstations and for restocking, but things like your specific book trades that you've unlocked will still be there. So all of that leaves us with a few remaining questions about how the underlying mechanics of villages work now, particularly for things like villager breeding and iron golem farming. I'm not going to go into tutorial levels of detail here, mostly for time reasons, but if you have any questions about it, I am always open to them. For villager breeding, the big factor is no longer doors, but instead beds. The actual mechanics of villager breeding are much the same as they were before, you just need to make sure they think they have more than enough beds to fill instead of enough doors. So you no longer need doors or the extra villager in your system, but now the most important thing is that you need to get the baby villagers at least 64 blocks away so they aren't claiming your beds. In the end, it's not any more complicated, but it does take up a good bit more space. Iron golem farming is a bit more complex of a change. The golems are no longer tied to the village itself, but rather will spawn when enough villagers want them to based on their gossip. In short, you need a group of villagers who can all talk to each other, and each one needs access to both a bed and a workstation of some kind. Without all of these different things, golems cannot continuously spawn. As the golems also spawn within a set distance of a specific villager, you're also going to need a method to pull them away so you can quickly kill them. Despite all of this, it is still possible to farm iron golems, and it's surprisingly not terribly slow, but it will likely never be possible to push to the same extent we did with the advanced iron farms we had before. Mojang has surprisingly showed interest in hearing the community's suggestions for improving iron farming, so this may still change at some point in the future, or a better alternative may be added. Naturally, there's a lot more detail that could be covered here, but for the sake of brevity, that is the gist of it. Again, if you have any questions on the state of these farms going forward and how to work with them, feel free to ask. There is one last thing relating to villagers to cover, and that is the new Wandering Trader. This is a special villager that will periodically spawn in your world, either relatively close to a player or near a village meeting point. The first thing you may notice is their lovely llama assistants, which are actually a unique type of llama with distinct visual decorations, and will attack anything that hurts their trader. These guys can be llama napped and tamed if you want to keep some around. The Wandering Trader himself is, as you may imagine, a wandering merchant of sorts who sells various things from across the world. This can include some noteworthy trades, things like saplings you may not have access to, sea pickles, coral blocks, blue ice, even nautilus shells, and of course these are traded for various amounts of emeralds. This guy is fairly uncommon. He'll only try to spawn once every day or so, and the chance for it to be successful is only a max of 7.5%, or even lower if one spawned recently. If he happens to be out at nighttime, he'll drink an invisibility potion to hide from monsters, and there can also only be one at a time per world, so if you're on a crowded server, he'll be quite a rare sight. Unfortunately, that's not really much of a problem, as this guy isn't very useful. His trades are very limited, particularly on Java where they only range from 4 to 12 trades before locking. On Bedrock, he's a little more generous, trading between 8 and 32 times for different things. These trades also can't be unlocked, so once you've traded him, he's just done. On top of that, he will also despawn automatically 40 to 60 minutes after spawning, and this cannot be prevented, so you need to have some emeralds ahead of time if you want to take advantage at all. Let's move on and talk about Redstone a little bit. There wasn't a huge amount of change here, but there were a few significant developments, one of which is that performance of redstone dust was greatly improved, and as you may know, this is one of the biggest offenders for causing lag in redstone. It's still not perfect, but it was a significant improvement. Dispensers also had a new feature added. They can now use shears when powered. This of course means that fully automated wool farms are now a thing. The dispensers will even prevent any durability loss on the shears if there's nothing to be sheared when it's activated. They've also changed TNT and TNT minecarts to have a 100% drop rate on blocks, up from roughly 25% before. This means that simply dispensing TNT is actually a viable way of breaking blocks in things like wood and cobble generators now, instead of depending on things like the block 36 bug like we did before, which is good because that bug has actually been fixed. That's about it as far as redstone related changes go, but of course there were also a lot of changes to commands and the more technical back end of the game as well. As usual, covering these changes in full is a huge subject on its own, and it's a subject most people won't care too much about. As such, we're only going to cover some of the most surface level of these changes here. There were a couple changes to basic commands, things like the locate command being able to find the new outpost structures, or the time command now having units so you can set or add time in ticks, seconds, or Minecraft days. Those new units of time can also be used with the new schedule command, a way for map or data pack creators to time when certain things happen, which is actually a much bigger deal than it may sound like. There is also a lot of changes to how things drop and the capability of loot tables. For example, block drops are controlled by loot tables now, so you could increase the yield of crops or make logs drop as charcoal blocks when broken with a special tool, whatever you can think of. There's even a new block state tag that allows you to get things like redstone lamps that were automatically on when you place them down, or things like that. Another new addition is the jigsaw block. Currently this isn't super useful, it's used in piecing together the new villages and the pillager outposts, but all of that is very hard-coded at the moment. Technically, you could use this to make those structures generate with custom builds instead, but more importantly, this will most likely eventually be expanded and allow for more complex custom builds to be easily placed into worlds. Just something to keep an eye on in the future. Of course, there is much more than this, but as I said before, it's kind of a niche topic and also one that would take a huge amount of time to cover fully. If you are interested, there is of course a full list of these changes on the changelog in the wiki, which will be linked in the description, and if you prefer things in video format, I would highly recommend keeping an eye on Sliced Lime's YouTube channel, which will also be linked in the description, as he tends to cover these topics very well shortly after release, likely much better than I could. As always, there were plenty of smaller, more miscellaneous changes as well, arguably the most notable of which are the changes to the player's position in confined spaces. There's two changes here. One is that the crouching player is now only 1.5 blocks tall, meaning you can now crouch and walk through 1.5 block tall gaps. There was also a change that makes it so your player will stay laying down if they're in a 1 block tall area, whether by swimming, elytra, ender pearling, or just closing a trapdoor on yourself. This means that it is now officially supported in the game for us to crawl around in 1 block tall areas. Some other small changes include new death messages for the sweetberry bushes, rabbit stew and beetroot soup are now shapeless recipes, tamed wolves kills now count as a player kill once again, including giving rare mob drops, broken and despawning leaves will occasionally drop sticks, dead bushes can be used as a fuel source, new statistics were added for interacting with the new utility blocks and for fighting against the raids, and you can all search the creative menu using the tag system from 1.13. There's also plenty of changes to advancements. First up is that some old advancements were modified. The parrots and the bats and best friends forever now require cats instead of ocelots. 2x2 also requires cats instead of ocelots and requires pandas as well as foxes now. Monster hunted no longer requires polar bears. A balanced diet now requires suspicious stew and sweet berries. And how did we get here now requires saturation and blindness effects, as those can be gotten from suspicious stew. And of course we got several new advancements as well. Voluntary exile for killing a pillager raid captain, hero of the village for defending a village from a raid, Ol' Betsy for shooting a crossbow, who's the pillager now for killing a pillager with a crossbow, 2 birds 1 arrow for killing 2 phantoms with a single piercing arrow from a crossbow, Arbalistic for killing 5 unique mobs with a single piercing arrow from a crossbow, and a complete catalog for taming all 11 of the new cat variants. You'll also find a lot of changes before you even get into your world. For example, the loading screen when you first launch doesn't actually freeze the game anymore. You may have noticed you previously couldn't do things like move the window while it was loading. That's no longer a problem. Once it does finish loading, you'll see a nice fade into our lovely new main menu screen, showcasing the new villages a little bit. And you may also notice they've added a shortcut to the accessibility options right on the front menu. Accessibility in general was also improved. You can now tab or shift tab to cycle through menu options, use space or enter to select things, and use your arrow keys to modify sliders. The narrator has also been improved to narrate buttons you have selected or hovered over, and there's also an option to darken the background behind text to make it more legible. There's also a new menu screen under the controls section, specifically for mouse settings. That's where you'll find your sensitivity, as well as some new options to control how sensitive scrolling is if you're one of the people who have had problems with that being unpredictable in recent versions. When you go to enter your world, you'll see a new visual indicator of the chunks being generated as the game loads. Once it does load, the F3 plus T combination, which reloads your resource packs, also has had some improvements in how it loads the game. This actually gives kind of an interesting freeze frame effect when it loads, which would be kind of a cool feature on its own someday. There were also some changes behind the scenes, for example separating the particles as well as painting textures into individual texture files rather than one big one. This opens up some interesting options for resource packs, such as animating specific paintings. Of course, there were also plenty of performance improvements. I mentioned some of the implications of the new lighting system previously. This was actually the result of a pretty big change in how that system works, and there should be a noticeable performance increase as a result, particularly from things like large-scale light updates. Certain tweaks to mobs were also made to improve performance, things like improvements to the fish schooling AI, as well as making it so mobs will no longer spawn at all if they're out of spawn range, whereas before they would spawn just to instantly despawn afterwards. Speaking of mobs, let's go ahead and move straight on to our last topic. Finally, bug fixes. As usual, this update has had quite a lot, including fixing some bugs that were quite useful to players. For the sake of our sanity, both yours and my own, we're going to focus specifically on the more noticeable ones. When you look at an enderman, they will now stay in place and wait for you to look away before attacking. This was actually their original behavior, but has been bugged for over 5 years. Creepers killed by strays will now drop records, previously they wouldn't. Invisibility actually works as intended now, previously several mobs just ignored it entirely, guardians being a prominent example. Crops are now able to grow even with a solid block above them. You can now plant seeds or nether warts by clicking on the side of an adjacent block, which is great for AFK farming. And the third-person camera no longer collides with plants or other blocks that don't have collision. So far so good, but like I said, there are others that did remove some useful quirks in the game. Falling block entities will no longer float on top of fences. This was previously used to create gravel or sand half slabs, vertical slabs, false floors, fake lighting, all kinds of stuff. Unfortunately, that is no longer possible. Blocks that previously absorbed light no longer do, most notably magma blocks. Previously, you could put a light source next to these and turn them into a light source themselves. This is no longer the case, and any old blocks you've done this with will automatically be dark come 1.14, so be sure you go and light those areas up before this update hits. Whew, and with that, I think we are finally done. You should now know everything you need to know when the Village and Pillage update hits your worlds and servers in the coming weeks. At this point, there should not be any significant changes before then, but if there are, I will be sure to leave them in a pinned comment down below, so be sure to scroll down and check for that before you go. If you want to look through the changelog for yourself, there will be a link to that in the description as well. Naturally, if you have any questions about the update, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to help you out, but for now, that's all I've got. So, hopefully this was helpful to you, and not dreadfully boring. Apologies again for the sheer length of the video, but, well, that's going to do it for me. So I'll see you guys next time.